Close your eyes for just a moment and picture this. The year is 1873. The sun is still hiding beneath the horizon. The stars are fading, and the crisp air of the open plains stings your lungs with every breath. You shift on your bedroll, laid out on hard, unforgiving earth, and your back aches from another night under the endless western sky. Around you, shadows begin to stir, the cowboys rising slowly, rubbing sore muscles, preparing for yet another grueling day on the trail. This isn't the romantic Wild West from the movies. There are no polished heroes riding into town to cheers and applause. What you're about to step into is the real life of a cowboy. Get dust that never leaves your mouth, calloused hands that split open from rope burns, clothes stiff with sweat and grit. A world where the sun beats down mercilessly by day and nights are colder than steel. Tonight, we're going to travel back into that world together. We'll walk in the boots of a cowboy driving cattle north across open country. We'll feel the exhaustion of 14 hours in the saddle, the relief of bitter coffee at dawn, and the constant anxiety of knowing that danger weather from storms, rustlers, or a sudden stampede lurks just beyond the edge of the herd. And along the way, we'll see how the reality of cowboy life was not glamorous at all. But instead, a relentless test of endurance, grit, and willpower. But here's the part that makes this journey fascinating. Despite all the hardships, despite the pain, and despite the low pay, thousands of men chose this life. Some were immigrants searching for opportunity. Others were formerly enslaved people carving out a new chapter of freedom. And many were just restless young men desperate for adventure. Together, they created one of the most iconic and most misunderstood chapters of American history. Now, before we saddle up and ride out, let me pause for just a moment. If you enjoy stories like this history, told in a way that lets you live it rather than read about it, I'd love for you to support this channel. A simple like helps more people discover these stories. And if you subscribe, you'll never miss the next journey we take into the forgotten corners of the past. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you were listening from and what time of day it is. It always amazes me how these stories connect people across time zones, across countries, and across generations. So, find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and allow yourself to drift into another era. You've just opened your eyes in the American West, somewhere on the trail between Texas and Kansas. The cattle are restless. The fire at the chuck wagon is already crackling, and the trail boss is shouting for the men to rise. Your day as a cowboy begins now. As your eyes adjust to the dim gray light of dawn, you begin to sense the vastness of the land stretching out around you. A landscape that seems to have no end, where the horizon melts into a pale band of color that promises the coming sunrise, and where the silence of early morning is quickly broken by the distant shuffle of hooves and the low, restless murmurs of cattle shifting in their sleep. This is the American West in the 1870s, a place both beautiful and unforgiving, a land that inspires awe with its endless skies and rolling prairies. It demands every ounce of strength and endurance from those who try to carve out a living upon it. For a cowboy, this was the world that defined daily existence, a rugged stage upon which survival was never guaranteed. And comfort was little more than a fleeting luxury found in a steaming cup of coffee, a warm fire, or a stolen moment of rest under the stars. It is tempting to imagine this life as a grand adventure, a storybook tale of men on horseback chasing freedom across the frontier. But the truth was far more complicated, far more demanding, and at times far more punishing than any dime novel or later Hollywood film would ever admit. The cowboy's work was not simply about riding into town and showing off a quick draw. It was about spending weeks on end in the saddle, herding thousands of Longhorn cattle across rivers, plains, and ravines, braving sudden storms that could turn dry ground into rivers of mud, guarding against predators and rustlers who might strike in the dead of night, and enduring the monotony of day after day beneath a blazing sun or through a night so cold it could make your bones ache. To live as a cowboy meant accepting a rhythm of life dictated entirely by the needs of the herd and the commands of the trail boss. The day began not with comfort, but with fatigue carried over from the night before, as men rose stiff and sore from the ground, their bedrolls damp with morning dew, their throats dry with dust that never truly left them, and their bodies already weary before the first horse was saddled. Meals were quick, simple, and functional: beans cooked over the fire, bacon fried until crisp, biscuits when the cook was feeling generous, and coffee so strong that a spoon might stand in it without sinking. These meals were not meant to be enjoyed, but to keep men going, to provide enough energy for another 14 hours of relentless labor on the trail. And yet, for all of its hardships, the cowboy life carried a strange allure. Men came to the trail from every background imaginable: former enslaved people seeking freedom and independence, Mexican vaqueros whose traditions and skills shaped nearly every aspect of the cowboy trade, immigrants from Europe drawn by the promise of the frontier, and restless young men born in the territories who had known no life but one in the saddle. Out here, far from the farms and cities, these men were equals in their struggles, bound not by origin or wealth, but by the shared experience of long rides, blistering heat, bone-chilling nights, and the ever-present possibility that one mistake, one spooked steer, one mishandled crossing, one overlooked danger could mean disaster for the herd and death for the men who guarded it. So when you take that first breath of sharp morning air and hear the trail boss barking orders, when you see the chuck wagon already smoking with the promise of coffee, and when you feel the familiar ache in your muscles reminding you of yesterday's ride, you are stepping not into the world of legend, but into the reality of cowboy life in the 1870s. A reality that was grueling, exhausting, and endlessly demanding, yet at the same time strangely magnetic, drawing generation after generation of men who were willing to trade comfort and safety for freedom. Resilience in the raw experience of living on the edge of the American frontier. When most people today think of cowboys, the first images that often come to mind are not drawn from the dusty cattle trails of Texas or the windswept plains of Kansas, but from the glowing screens of movie theaters and the dog-eared pages of pulp novels, where cowboys were transformed into larger-than-life figures, men with perfectly pressed hats and spotless boots, who rode into town with an easy swagger, exchanged a few sharp words with the villain, and then settled every conflict with a quick draw and a single dramatic gunfight on the main street, followed, of course, by a triumphant ride into the sunset as the townsfolk cheered. This was the Hollywood version of the West, polished, heroic, and endlessly thrilling, but it was a fantasy, a story designed to sell tickets and capture imaginations rather than to reflect the reality endured by the men who actually lived that life. In truth, the real cowboy would hardly recognize himself in those glossy portrayals. His boots were not gleaming, but caked with layers of dried mud, manure, and dust that clung so thickly they cracked and hardened like plaster. His hat was not always stylishly tilted, but often misshapen, sweat-stained, and weather-beaten from countless days beneath the relentless sun and countless nights in the rain. The gun on his hip, if he even carried one, was rarely drawn. For the cowboy's survival depended less on quick reflexes in a duel and more on patience, skill, and endurance, the ability to ride for hours without rest, to guide cattle across swollen rivers without losing them, to stay awake during long night watches, guarding against stampedes, and to handle ropes and saddles until his hands were raw and bleeding. Hollywood painted the West as a stage for glory, where the cowboy was always the central hero, admired by all, feared by his enemies, and remembered as a legend. The reality was far more anonymous and unforgiving. Cowboys were often poorly paid, earning little more than $1 a day for work that demanded nearly every waking hour of their strength. They were not applauded for their bravery, nor celebrated for their endurance. Instead, their names were forgotten as soon as the drive ended, their stories swallowed by the endless churn of the next herd moving north. While the myth promised fame and recognition, the truth offered obscurity, long days of labor, and the ever-present ache of exhaustion. And yet, perhaps, it was precisely this contrast between myth and reality that gave cowboy life its strange allure. For while Hollywood stripped away the grime, the hunger, and the bone-deep fatigue, it captured something that was undeniably real: the idea of resilience, the stubborn refusal to quit, the sense of freedom that came from working under the wide, open sky with no walls to contain you and no clock to dictate your hours. In this way, the myths and the reality of the cowboy became tangled together, one shaping the other, until it became impossible to separate fact from legend, hardship from heroism, or dust from gold. And so, as you ride deeper into the world of the 1870s trail, you begin to understand that being a cowboy was never about living a Hollywood dream, but about enduring a reality so harsh and demanding that only through struggle did it take on the glow of legend. The day for a cowboy did not begin with comfort or luxury, nor with the lazy stretching of a man waking beneath warm blankets in a quiet room, but with the harsh reality of rising before the first light of dawn. The stars still glimmered faintly overhead, and the cold of night clung stubbornly to the ground. The earth beneath him, which had served as a bed, left his back stiff and sore, his joints aching from hours spent pressed against soil and stone. And as he pushed himself up from his bedroll, brushing away dust and dew, he was reminded once again that softness was not part of this life. The smell of smoke from the chuck wagon's early fire drifted across camp, mingling with the sharp scent of coffee, strong enough to jolt the senses awake, though even that bitter warmth could do little to erase the fatigue that had already settled deep into every muscle. There was no time to linger or to complain, for the cattle stirred restlessly at the edges of camp, shifting hooves, grinding the earth, their low calls breaking the quiet of morning, and the trail boss's voice gruff, commanding, anting, and impatient, cut through the air like a whip, ordering men to saddle up and prepare for the long march ahead. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was eaten quickly and without ceremony. Beans reheated from the night before, bacon fried in a pan blackened by years of use, and biscuits that crumbled dry in the mouth, all washed down with gulps of coffee so strong it was less a drink than a weapon against exhaustion. It was fuel, not a feast, consumed while standing or crouching near the fire. Every man too aware that time was short and the herd waited. Once in the saddle, the true grind of the day began, a relentless test of endurance that stretched on for hours beneath the wide, merciless sky. Cowboys rode in assigned positions around the herd, point men guiding the front, flank riders keeping the sides in line, drag men trailing behind to drive stragglers forward, and each roll carried its own burdens. The drag was the worst, for it meant riding in the choking dust kicked up by thousands of hooves, dust that filled the nose and mouth until every breath tasted of grit, dust that clung to skin and clothes until men were unrecognizable by midday. The sun rose higher, beating down with a heat so fierce it seemed to press the very air flat against the earth, and there was no escape from it, no shade beyond the brim of a hat, no relief except the endurance of sheer willpower. The cattle moved slowly but never smoothly, for at any moment a sudden noise, a flash of lightning, or even a shift in the wind could send the herd surging into a wild, dangerous stampede, and it was the cowboy's duty to prevent such chaos. Every sense was sharpened by the need to anticipate trouble: the twitch of an ear, the sudden lift of a head, the nervous shuffle of hoofs, since so the hours dragged on in a haze of vigilance, where time itself seemed to blur into the endless rhythm of hoofs, the creak of leather saddles, and the sting of sweat dripping into eyes already raw from dust and wind. When night finally came, bringing with it a chill that cut through even the heaviest coats. The work did not end, for the herd still needed watching. Cowboys took turns riding night guard, circling the herd in silence, singing low songs to soothe the cattle, their voices drifting softly across the darkened plain. Sleep was snatched in brief intervals, never deep, never restorative, and always on the same hard ground that greeted them the morning before. Thus, each new day began already layered with the fatigue of the last cycle of exhaustion and duty that repeated itself for weeks on end, until the body no longer remembered comfort and the mind no longer expected it. And yet, amid the soreness, the hunger, the dust, and the endless labor, there was a strange rhythm, a rough poetry in the life itself. For the cowboy was not trapped behind walls or bound by the ticking of a clock, but instead lived by the rise and fall of the sun, the steady movement of cattle, and the unspoken bond between men who endured it all together beneath the vast and endless sky of the American West. When the herd was finally settled for a brief pause and the men were granted a stolen moment of rest, their thoughts turned not to comfort or leisure, for such things were foreign luxuries on the trail, but to the chuck wagon and whatever the cook had managed to scrape together, from supplies that seemed to dwindle with each passing day. Meals on the cattle drive were never extravagant feasts laid out in abundance, but rather simple, functional affairs designed to fill the stomach just enough to keep men in the saddle for another stretch of endless miles. Beans were the constant companion, simmered in heavy iron pots until the smoky flavor seeped into every bite, sometimes spiced with a bit of chili when fortune allowed, but more often plain and hearty, a food that could be eaten quickly and stored well, its simplicity a reminder of the practicality that ruled every aspect of trail life. Bacon, salted and cured to withstand the long journey, crackled in pans blackened with years of use, its sharp scent rising into the air and mingling with the omnipresent dust and smoke, smell that was both a comfort and a burden. For though the taste was welcome, the grease clung to clothes and hands, following men long after the last strip had been swallowed. Biscuits, dense and heavy, were another staple, sometimes little more than flour and water, pressed into rough shapes and baked over the fire. But when the cook's mood was generous and supplies permitted, they carried a touch of softness that reminded weary cowboys, if only for a fleeting moment, of kitchens far from the trail and of meals shared at home. And then there was the coffee, the one true constant of the cowboy's diet, brewed strong enough to jolt even the most exhausted rider into wakefulness, its bitterness a shock against the tongue, yet, strangely, welcome, for without it, the long hours of dawn, patrol, or night watch would have been nearly unbearable. The coffee was boiled directly in great blackened pots, often until it was so thick that grounds floated freely in every cup. And yet the men drank it greedily, swallowing it scalding hot, grateful for the warmth that spread through their bones and the brief illusion of renewed energy it provided. No one expected refinement or delicacy in such a place. The chuck wagon was not a restaurant, and the trail was not a place for indulgence. These meals were fuel, plain and unadorned, meant to sustain bodies already stretched to their limits, and in that purpose they never failed. Still, around the fire, in those rare moments when work paused and plates were passed from hand to hand, there was a kind of quiet camaraderie that softened the edges of hardship. Men laughed at the cook's temper, joked about the endless repetition of beans, and found solace in the ritual of eating together beneath the wide, star-filled sky. It was not the food itself that mattered, for it was meager and repetitive, but the shared act of gathering, of breaking the monotony of the trail with the simple comfort of hot food and warm voices that gave these meals their true value. And so, even as the men grumbled about biscuits hard enough to break teeth or coffee strong enough to stand on its own, they knew that without these small, humble offerings, the trail would have been far more unforgiving than it already was. Once the brief respite of breakfast had passed, the men mounted their horses and prepared to face the day in earnest, knowing full well that what lay ahead was not simply a ride, but an unbroken gauntlet of physical and mental endurance, stretching from the pale light of dawn to the fiery glow of sunset. A relentless span of 14, 15, sometimes even 16 hours in the saddle that tested the limits of human stamina in ways few could imagine. The horse became both companion and instrument of survival, its rhythm dictating the pace of the day and its temperament influencing the very safety of the rider. For a nervous or stubborn animal could spell disaster not only for the cowboy, but for the herd, which required constant vigilance, precise direction, and a delicate balance between pressure and patience. Each shift in position demanded attention. Each turn or halt required coordination with other riders, and every correction made to guide thousands of longhorns across open plains, through rocky passes, and over winding rivers. The trail itself was rarely forgiving. Dust rose in clouds that clung to skin, eyes, and clothing, infiltrating every fold of fabric and grain of exposed skin, leaving a permanent layer of grit that made swallowing, blinking, and breathing a constant effort. Sunlight beat down relentlessly from a sky unbroken by shade, heating leather saddles and metal stirrups until they were almost unbearable to touch, while the wind saddened, dry, and merciless scoured the plains and whipped at exposed faces with a sting that only added to the men's fatigue. Muscles ached continuously. It's not just from exertion, but from the unyielding posture required to remain balanced in the saddle. Hips and legs taut, core engaged, fingers gripping reins so tightly that knuckles whitened, and yet even pain became a companion, familiar and constant. Part of the rhythm of life that made the moments of brief relief feel almost miraculous in contrast. The small breaks between exertions were fleeting, measured not by comfort, but by necessity. And during these intervals, men could do little more than shift in the saddle, sip the last of their coffee, or stretch weary limbs, ever aware that the herd would not halt for fatigue, that the ground could hide hazards that might unseat a rider in an instant, and that the next river crossing or rocky incline demanded perfect alertness and unhesitating action. Time itself blurred into a continuous motion of hooves and dust, the hours marked only by the changing angle of the sun, the shifting shadows across the prairie, and the occasional grunt or shout from a fellow rider warning of a straggler or a sudden disturbance. Fatigue was constant, gnawing at the edges of attention and threatening lapses that could have catastrophic consequences. For a single mistake on the trail, misjudging a steer, failing to notice a hole, or losing control of a frightened animal could trigger a stampede, endangering men, horses, and the entire herd. And yet, there was a strange, almost meditative quality to these long hours in the saddle. As the men rode, muscles screaming, bodies slick with sweat and dust, minds sharpened by necessity, there was a rhythm to the work that demanded complete presence. The sway of the horse, the low hum of distant cattle, the faint rustle of prairie grass beneath the wind, and the endless horizon stretching toward nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was a grueling life, one of repetition, danger, and exhaustion. Yet in that repetition and in the quiet moments of connection with the land, the herd, and one another, the cowboys found a form of purpose and a kind of freedom that the comforts of town and the safety of hearth and home could never provide. Stark, elemental existence that defined the very essence of what it meant to live on the American frontier. No matter how careful a cowboy tried to be, no matter how tightly he pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, or how thoroughly he brushed his clothes before mounting, dust was an ever-present companion on the trail, an invisible force that infiltrated every corner of his life and refused to be ignored. It clung stubbornly to every surface, settling in the seams of his clothing, coating leather saddles, and embedding itself in the rough fibers of his shirt until even a small movement sent it rising again in tiny clouds, catching in the sunlight like a faint golden haze above the herd. The air itself seemed to carry it, riding every gust of wind across the open prairie, seeping into lungs with each breath and scratching the throat with an abrasive persistence that made swallowing a constant, conscious effort. Eyes watered from its intrusion, and even when blinked repeatedly, a fine film would remain, gritty and unrelenting, cutting against vision until men grew accustomed to the constant irritation, learning to see through the haze as best they could while maintaining vigilance over cattle, terrain, and horse alike. At times, the dust became more than a nuisance. It was a relentless test of endurance and patience. A simple gust of wind could turn a day of steady riding into a struggle for survival, as clouds of fine particles rolled off hooves and horns, invading every exposed crevice of a cowboy's body and belongings. Bandanas became shields, hats were pulled lower, and gloves offered little defense against the constant abrasion. Yet the dust pressed on regardless, a silent reminder that the land gave no quarter and demanded respect through endurance and adaptability. Even meals, taken quickly at the edge of campfires or near the chuck wagon, were tainted with its presence. Beans and biscuits were no longer merely food, but carriers of the same fine grit that had settled into boots, coats, and hair, so that swallowing meant ingesting a mixture of nourishment and the very earth they rode across. Sleep offered no true respite either. At night, when cowboys rolled out their bedrolls across the hard-packed ground, the dust from days of travel had already infiltrated the area, working its way into the fibers of blankets and the folds of clothing. Even in dreams, it seemed to follow, a constant, intangible companion that reminded men that the West did not yield to comfort or ease. The skin, eyes, and lungs carried evidence of every mile traveled, every herd guided, every hour spent beneath the merciless sun or against a wind that scattered particles in all directions, leaving cowboys coated in a fine, uniform layer of the land itself. A testament to the life they had chosen, a mark of endurance and survival that was as invisible to outsiders as it was inescapable to those who lived it. And yet, there was something elemental about this relentless presence, a strange intimacy with the land that only dust could bring. It was a constant, physical reminder that the cowboys were not masters of the frontier, but participants in it, bound to the rhythms of cattle, weather, and terrain, and that survival required acceptance of this ceaseless intrusion, the ability to keep moving, keep riding, and keep watching, despite the grime that worked its way into every aspect of life. Dust was not simply dirt, it was part of the story, woven into the fabric of existence, an ever-present character in the saga of the cattle drive, shaping bodies, testing patience, and defining the harsh, unglamorous reality of life on the open trail. Amid all the dust, the relentless sun, and the unending monotony of trail life, it was the people who rode alongside you who truly defined the experience. A mosaic of humanity, forged from disparate histories, yet united by the shared rhythm of the herd and the demands of the trail. Men who had come together under circumstances both harsh and improbable, and who now relied on one another for survival in a world that demanded strength, skill, and resilience above all else. Here, in the rolling plains of the American West, the cowboy was not a single archetype, but a tapestry of backgrounds, each individual bringing his own story, his own history, his own reasons for enduring the punishing reality of life on the trail. There were former slaves from the South, men who had known bondage and hardship, yet found in the open frontier a tentative freedom, a space to apply skills learned under oppression to a life where the horizon itself became a kind of promise, and whose strength, patience, and wisdom were invaluable on long drives where every decision could make the difference between disaster and safety. Alongside them rode Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys, whose techniques, traditions, and knowledge of the land were passed down through generations, shaping every aspect of American cattle driving from the handling of the rope to the careful guidance of herds across treacherous terrain. These men carried with them not only expertise, but a cultural depth, a philosophy of horsemanship and land stewardship that had been refined over centuries. Their influence felt in every knot tied, every maneuver executed, and every story shared around the crackling fire at night. European immigrants, drawn by the allure of opportunity on the frontier, added yet another layer to this complex social landscape. Young men eager to prove themselves, their energy and optimism tempered by the grueling reality of daily life, learning to navigate unfamiliar terrain, language, and customs, while discovering that endurance and adaptability were as essential as skill in the saddle. And then there were the young men born in the territories themselves, raised on the edge of the known world, whose lives had been shaped by the open plains and by the constant necessity of labor from an early age, who understood instinctively the behavior of horses, temperament of cattle, and the cruel beauty of the land they called home. These men, products of the frontier, often served as the bridge between tradition and innovation, blending old techniques with improvisation, demonstrating a quiet confidence that came from having no choice but to live and survive in the rugged environment around them. Despite the differences in language, culture, and origin, on the trail, these men were not defined by their pasts, but by their ability to endure, to cooperate, and to meet the constant challenges presented by the open West. Hierarchies were based not on birth or background, but on skill, reliability, and courage under pressure. And even the most inexperienced rider could earn respect through competence, resourcefulness, and an unwavering commitment to the herd and to the men beside him. Round the campfire, amid the smoke, the chatter, the occasional bursts of laughter, stories were shared and lessons passed down, a tapestry of human experience woven into the very fabric of the trail, creating bonds that transcended origin, race, and class, and giving shape to a culture defined as much by cooperation, loyalty, and endurance as by the dust, sun, and endless miles they collectively endured. In this way, the cowboy life of the 1870s was not just an individual struggle against the land, the weather, and the herd, but a shared human endeavor, a living experiment in collaboration and survival, where the diversity of backgrounds became a source of strength, where experience and tradition intertwined, and where every rider, regardless of origin, became a vital thread in the unbroken chain of men who called the open trail their world, their school, and their home. Yet, despite the remarkable diversity of backgrounds and the vast differences in upbringing, culture, and experience, the trail had a leveling effect unlike anything the cowboys might have known before. For out here, every man was bound by the same unyielding realities of life in the saddle, and none were exempt from the hardships that defined each day. The work did not discriminate, the sun and wind and dust paying no heed to whether a rider was a former slave from the deep south, a Mexican vaquero with generations of horsemanship behind him, a wide-eyed European immigrant eager for fortune, or a young frontier-born hand raised among the plains and prairies. Each man faced the same unrelenting rhythm of dawn-to-dusk exertion, the same bone-deep fatigue that settled into muscles, the same ever-present threat of stampedes, river crossings, and sudden storms that could turn the mundane act of moving cattle into a fight for life itself. Pay, too, was equal in a manner that felt almost revolutionary for the era. A flat daily wage that ignored social hierarchies and focused solely on the contributions of each man to the collective effort, an arrangement that required no apologies or explanations because, on the trail, the cowboy's worth was measured in reliability, skill, and endurance rather than birthright, ethnicity, or social standing. This equality, however, was practical rather than ideological. It existed because the trail demanded cohesion and cooperation, and because survival depended on mutual accountability. For the loss of one man, one horse, or one handful of cattle could imperil the entire drive. Each cowboy, regardless of origin, understood that his actions had immediate consequences, not only for himself, but for every other rider, every animal, and the success of the herd itself. There was a sense of fairness born of necessity, a hard-earned respect for equality that arose naturally from the circumstances rather than being imposed artificially. Living conditions, like pay and risk, were also universally harsh, raising distinctions that might have separated men in towns or cities back east. Bedrolls on the cold, dusty ground, wool blankets, stiff and scratchy, meals of beans and bacon taken hastily at the edge of the campfire. Nights spent alert for disturbances in the herd all were experiences shared collectively, and all were endured without complaint, because it was understood that discomfort was the price of life on the trail. Even small comforts, like a warm fire, a shared joke, or the brief taste of fresh water at a stream, were magnified in significance precisely because they were equally inaccessible to every man present. There was no favoritism, no division, and no insulation from the realities of frontier life. The cowboys were bound together by the equality of their toil, their exposure, and their vulnerability. And in that shared experience, they forged bonds deeper than mere friendship, a tacit understanding that each man's survival depended on the other's competence, courage, and vigilance. Was in this crucible of equality, forged by the unforgiving land and the relentless demands of the herd, that the true character of a cowboy was revealed not in the flashy gestures or cinematic heroics of later myth, but in the quiet acts of endurance, the subtle adjustments of the reins, the shared laughter in fleeting moments of respite, and the steadfast presence of a companion who had ridden beside you through dust, sun, and danger, facing the same trials and sharing the same meager rewards, bound together by circumstance, necessity, and the unspoken promise that no man would be left behind while the herd moved inexorably north toward the railhead in whatever fleeting glory, pay, or rest awaited them there. With the morning light casting long shadows across the endless prairie, the herd began to stir, a restless sea of thousands of Longhorn cattle whose horns and hides reflected the sun's first golden rays. And it was here, amid the shifting mass of dust, whose, in lowing calls, that the true work of the trail commenced in earnest. Moving such vast numbers of animals was never a simple task. It required constant vigilance, unerring judgment, and the ability to anticipate the unpredictable instincts of both cattle and horse alike. Each cowboy assumed a position within the moving expanse, some riding the flanks to prevent strays from wandering into the brush, others at the rear, urging lagging animals forward, and the most experienced often taking the lead, guiding the herd along the invisible lines carved by previous drives and marked by natural features of the land. For one false turn or moment of hesitation could scatter the herd, to need hundreds of animals running chaotically and turning hours of meticulous progress into chaos within minutes. The sheer scale of the operation left little room for error. Every movement had to be deliberate, every gesture calculated, and yet the terrain was rarely accommodating. Rocky outcrops, hidden ravines, sudden creek beds, and steep inclines challenged both men and animals, demanding instant adaptation. As a horse stumbled, a steer balked, or the wind shifted, carrying scents and sounds that startled the herd and sent ripples of tension down the line. Communication was subtle but constant. The soft whistle, the raised hand, the tilt of a hat, or the rhythmic pattern of a rope being flicked, all cues that spoke volumes to those who understood their language. Directing thousands of pounds of unpredictable life in coordinated movement across hundreds of acres, the rhythm of riding became almost hypnotic. Hours melted into one another as cowboys maintained their posts, bodies aching, lungs rasping from dust and exertion, yet minds sharp and unyielding, always alert to the slightest shift in the herd's mood, for the consequences of negligence were immediate and often catastrophic. Meals, rest, and even conversation were subordinated to the herd's movement, for the trail was a living, breathing entity that would not wait for comfort or distraction. Days blended into nights as the herd pressed northward toward distant railheads, each mile marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing angle of shadows across the prairie, and the subtle cues of weather and terrain that dictated the pace and course of the journey. Cowhands rolled alongside the massive creatures, feeling the vibrations of hooves through the leather of the saddle, sensing the collective anxiety of thousands of animals and adjusting their own movements to calm, guide, or redirect the flow, often improvising solutions to unpredictable challenges while maintaining the delicate balance that kept both men and beasts safe. Evenings offered no real reprieve, for nightfall brought new responsibilities, standing watch over the herd to ensure safety from predators, rustlers, or the unexpected panic that could erupt without warning, and performing essential chores like checking water sources, reinforcing temporary corrals, and caring for exhausted animals. In this endless cycle of motion, vigilance, and labor, the cowboy became inseparable from the herd, attuned to the rhythms of its movement, the quirks of individual animals, and the subtle whispers of the land itself. Success was measured not in the comfort or luxury of the men, but in the gradual, painstaking progress of the herd toward its destination. Each mile a testament to endurance, skill, and unwavering attention, and each night a reminder that the cattle drive was a relentless test of human perseverance, patience, and courage, a grueling enterprise in which every rider, regardless of background, played a vital role in shepherding these vast, horned behemoths across a landscape as beautiful as it was unforgiving. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting a prairie in hues of molten gold and deepening indigo, the work of the day did not end for the cowboys, for the herd demanded constant vigilance, ceaseless commitment that stretched far beyond the hours of daylight and into the quiet, shadowed expanse of night. Crews assigned to night watch mounted their horses with a mixture of weariness and resolve, understanding that while the world around them might seem calm and silent, the slightest disturbance could trigger chaos that no amount of skill or experience could easily contain. Shadows stretched and danced across the plains, the faint rustle of wind through grass blending with the soft, low calls of the cattle. And it was in this delicate balance that the cowboys found their rhythm, riding slowly around the perimeter, alert to the subtleties of movement, sound, and scent that hinted at potential danger, to maintain control over the herd during these long hours of darkness. Cowboys employed a strategy, both practical and deeply human, singing, their voices unrefined and often roughened by dust and long days in the saddle, carried softly across the low hills and plains, not for the entertainment of the riders, but as a lifeline for the animals themselves. The steady, rhythmic cadence of the songs served as reassurance to the herd, a constant presence that told each steer and Longhorn that they were not alone, that the humans guiding them were near and attentive. The melodies were simple, often improvised, and filled with the memories of home, of past drives, or of the fleeting comforts of towns left behind. Yet in those quiet, pre-dawn hours, they became essential tools of survival, calming restless animals and preventing panicked stampedes that could destroy hours of careful progress in an instant. The cowboys themselves were tested in ways that few outsiders could imagine, balancing exhaustion from the day's ride with hypervigilance, their hands never far from the reins, their ears straining for the faintest sound of trouble, their eyes scanning the darkness for movement among the grazing herd, or the flash of a predator's eyes. Cold seeped into bones as the night deepened, wind cutting through coats and blankets, but the riders pressed on, singing softly, speaking in low tones, and moving with the careful deliberation born of experience, for every action had consequences, and every lapse could endanger not only the animals, but the men themselves. Even brief moments of distraction could be catastrophic, yet within this tension lay a strange, almost meditative clarity, a focus that sharpened the senses and bound man and beast together in a shared struggle against the elements, fatigue, and unpredictability of the frontier. When the first hints of dawn began to appear, pale light spreading across the horizon, cowboys would finally allow themselves a brief sense of relief, the herd calm and intact, the watch completed without incident. Yet there was no room for complacency, no indulgence in comfort, for the cycle of the trail was relentless. Day would bring new challenges, new hours in the saddle, and new tests of skill and endurance. But for these fleeting night hours, the singing, the slow circumnavigation of the herd, and the intimate knowledge of every animal's temperament became the quiet victories that sustained cowboys through the endless trials of life on the trail, testament to their ingenuity, patience, and the subtle, profound bond forged between human and animal across the open, unforgiving plains of the American West. To survive and thrive on the trail, a cowboy required a skill set that extended far beyond mere endurance or the ability to sit a horse for countless hours. It was a complex, interwoven mastery of techniques honed through years of practice, observation, and necessity, each skill vital to the safety of both man and herd, and each executed under conditions that tested patience, precision, and courage to their absolute limits. Riding was the foundation of this expertise, an intimate communion with a horse that demanded balance, subtlety, and instinct for every movement of the rider's body, every shift of weight, and every flick of the reins communicated intent to a creature weighing more than half a ton, a living partner whose cooperation could mean the difference between control and disaster. Through blinding dust, searing sun, or sudden storm, cowboys learned to feel the terrain beneath the hooves, to anticipate a stumble before it happened, and to coax their mount through dangerous slopes, rocky outcroppings, and the unpredictable reactions of thousands of restless cattle surrounding them, always maintaining an almost imperceptible dialogue between rider and animal that spoke of trust, respect, and shared survival. Roping, too, was not merely a skill, but a lifeline, a precision art that required keen eyesight, steady hands, and split-second judgment. For a rope could corral a runaway steer, subdue an animal caught in the underbrush, or rescue a companion from imminent harm, and failure in its use could have catastrophic consequences. A cowboy's expertise with the lariat was the culmination of muscle memory, experience, and intuition, each loop thrown with the unspoken knowledge of the animal as tendencies and the terrain as influence on its movement. This ability was complemented by a profound understanding of animal behavior, the quiet, almost imperceptible signals that indicated stress, fatigue, or fear, which could ripple through the herd and transform a calm evening into a panicked, chaotic stampede, if misread. Navigation, too, was a constant, silent challenge, while the wide-open prairie offered few landmarks. Hence, the trails were often marked only by the memory of previous drives. Subtle variations in vegetation, or the faint traces of the herd itself. Cowboys became adept at reading the landscape like a map, sensing the approach of a river or a hidden ravine, predicting weather shifts from changes in wind or cloud patterns, and guiding thousands of cattle along routes that balanced speed with safety. Always conscious that a single error in judgment could send the herd astray or expose it to deadly obstacles. Survival depended on this skill as much as any physical ability, for the open frontier was unforgiving, and knowledge of the land separated those who completed drives intact from those who suffered losses, both human and animal. And through it all, handling animals, cattle, horses, and occasional strays acquired a combination of authority, patience, and empathy. It's an ability to command respect without instilling fear, to respond to sudden movements with measured action, and to anticipate reactions before they fully manifested. Every twist of a steer's horn, every stamp of a hoof, Every snort of alarm became a signal that demanded interpretation, often under conditions of extreme fatigue, extreme heat, or the oppressive weight of the trail's dust and wind. Mastery of these skills was not optional, but essential. It defined competence, survival, and reputation on the trail. The cowboy's life was a perpetual performance of expertise, instinct, and endurance, where the success of each day depended on the seamless integration of riding, roping, navigation, and animal handling. It's a blend of art and science executed across miles of relentless, unpredictable terrain. And it was this combination that separated the experienced hands from the green riders, allowing the former to move with a quiet confidence that seemed almost effortless, yet had been earned only through endless hours of practice, observation, and hard-won experience in the harsh, unyielding world of the American West. Despite all the preparation, skill, and experience, the trail was never entirely predictable, and danger lurked at every turn, often arriving with sudden, terrifying immediacy that could transform a routine day into a battle for survival in the blink of an eye. Stampedes were the ever-present threat, unpredictable torrents of motion and panic that could erupt from the smallest provocation, a clap of thunder rolling across the plains, a startled predator glimpsed in the shadows, the jarring crack of a branch underfoot, or even the sudden, inexplicable movement of a single steer within the massive herd. For the collective instinct of thousands of longhorns magnified every signal into a tidal wave of motion. Once a stampede began, the ground seemed to tremble beneath the pounding hooves, dust rising in suffocating clouds that filled eyes and lungs alike, the deafening roar of thousands of animals echoing across the prairie as riders strained every nerve and sinew to contain the chaos. Their voices raised in shouts, their ropes and reins wielded with precision, born of desperation and experience. The unpredictability of the storm itself could trigger such panics, with lightning flashes and rolling thunder startling the herd into sudden, chaotic movement that left no time for hesitation. Cowboys learned quickly that survival depended not merely on reaction, but on anticipation, reading the sky, sensing shifts in wind, feeling the charge in the air before the first drop of rain fell, positioning themselves strategically to guide the animals, breaking potential surges before they became full-blown disasters. Even the most experienced hands could be thrown off balance by a sudden squall, a flash flood, or a gust that scattered the animals. For each event demanded split-second decisions where error could cost lives, cattle, or the hard-earned wages of weeks on the trail. Predators also played a silent role in the dangers of the plains, their presence more often felt than seen. A low growl, a shadow among the brush, or a fleeting glimpse of movement. And while a lone wolf or coyote might seem trivial, the reaction of the herd to such threats could be immediate and catastrophic. Cowboys learned to anticipate the collective anxiety of the herd, calming frightened animals through proximity, voice, or gentle guidance, but the tension never fully dissipated. Each night, each long hour on the trail carried the potential for sudden chaos, and vigilance became second nature, a constant undercurrent of awareness that demanded mental endurance equal to the physical. Even mundane noises, rustling branches, snapping twigs, or the distant call of a bird could ripple through the herd, amplified into a cascade of panic. In those moments, a cowboy's experience, calm demeanor, and ability to read the herd were the difference between containment and disaster. For once the longhorns began to surge, it was almost impossible to stop them without risking injury to man or beast. Hours could be consumed merely steering panicked animals back on course, repairing damage caused by trampling, or nursing horses exhausted from the frantic pursuit. And yet, in these trials, cowboys found themselves constantly tested, their skills sharpened, and their resilience forged in the crucible of a landscape, where danger was a constant companion and the line between order and chaos could vanish in an instant. Ultimately, the reality of stampedes and the ever-present threats of storms, its predators, and sudden noises underscored a truth that every cowboy knew instinctively. Life on the trail was a perpetual negotiation with the unpredictable forces of nature. Animals and chance, and survival required not only mastery of the saddle, rope, and lariat, but the calm courage to face the sudden, terrifying, and often unforgiving challenges that defined the life of a cowboy in the American West, where every day was a high-stakes balance between skill, instinct, and sheer endurance against a backdrop as beautiful as it was relentless. Among the many trials faced on the trail, few demanded the skill, courage, and nerve of a river crossing, where the placid surface of a shallow stream could conceal treacherous currents and hidden obstacles capable of sweeping both man and beast into unforgiving waters. These crossings were always approached with a mixture of careful calculation, whispered instructions, and the unspoken understanding that the margin for error was razor thin. For a single misstep, a misjudged footing, or a momentary lapse in attention could result in disaster, toppling a cowboy from his horse, trapping a steer against a submerged log, or drowning an otherwise healthy animal in the powerful undertow. The trail boss would gather the men in hushed tones before the first hoof struck water, assigning positions, outlining contingencies, and stressing the importance of patience and coordination. For the safety of the herd and the men themselves depended entirely on their ability to anticipate, react, and guide with precision. As the leading horses stepped into the water, the current tugging at their hooves, a wave of tension rippled through the cowboys. Their muscles coiled, reins taut, eyes scanning the stream for hidden rocks, sudden drops, or the first signs of panic among the cattle. The animals themselves, sensing the uncertainty beneath their hooves, sometimes balked at the water's edge, stamping impatiently or shifting erratically, and it fell to the cowboys to coax, nudge, and guide them forward, using a combination of voice, pressure from the stirrups, and gentle prods of the rope, all while maintaining balance on slick, uneven footing that could betray even the most experienced rider. Panic, once triggered, could spread like wildfire through the herd, each nervous movement multiplying the tension and risk exponentially. And the cowboys had to act with calm authority, thinking several steps ahead, or reacting instantly to the unpredictable instincts of thousands of pounds of horned muscle. The crossing itself was a delicate choreography, horses, cattle, and men moving as a single organism, each step calculated, each moment a negotiation with physics, instinct, and the terrain. Water surged around legs and hooves, swirling into eddies that threatened to unseat the horses or pull a calf under. And yet, through grit, experience, and near-intuitive understanding of animal behavior, cowboys guided the herd steadily across, often taking turns reinforcing weak swimmers, rescuing strays, and ensuring that the larger, more stubborn cattle did not block the flow or cause a pileup midstream. Even after the last horn disappeared from the water, the work was far from over. Men checked every animal for injuries, soothed frightened beasts, repaired makeshift dams or pathways to prevent similar dangers downstream, all while dealing with exhausted horses that needed water, forage, and attention after the strain of battling the current. These river crossings were more than physical challenges. They were tests of leadership, judgment, and nerve, moments when a cowboy's knowledge, patience, courage were exposed to the raw unpredictability of the frontier. Tales of disasters that claimed dozens of cattle, or even lives, were shared around campfires to instill respect for the power of water, the hazards of complacency, and the necessity of teamwork under pressure. But each successful crossing became a quiet triumph, a confirmation of skill and resilience, a tangible reminder that the trail was as much a lesson in patience, calculation, and adaptation as it was a journey of endurance. To witness a herd flowing safely across a turbulent river, every horn and hoof accounted for, every rider alert yet composed, was to see the essence of cowboy life distilled into a moment of high-stakes mastery over chaos, where instinct, experience, and unwavering attention converged to conquer the mercurial forces of nature that ruled the American West with impartial severity. If the rivers did not test the mettle of a cowboy, the weather certainly would. For the plains of the American West were governed by extremes that spared no one, shaping every moment of life on the trail with their merciless rhythms. By day, the sun hung heavy in a cloudless sky, an unrelenting orb that seemed to burn with a personal intensity, its rays striking down on men, animals, and earth alike, drying lips, searing skin, and baking the loose dust into a choking haze that coated every surface and filled every breath with grit. Under this oppressive glare, a cowboy's endurance was taxed not only by the physical labor of riding, roping, and guiding thousands of longhorns across the undulating prairie, but also by the mental strain of maintaining vigilance when every muscle ached, every joint protested, and the very air seemed to sap energy with each inhale. Even with the protection of wide-brimmed hats, bandanas, and thick boots, the relentless sun penetrated every layer, constant reminder that the elements themselves were as formidable an adversary as any stampede, river, or predator encountered along the way. And then, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, trading its fierce blaze for twilight's subtle coolness, a different, equally unforgiving test emerged. Night on the trail brought a bitter cold that crept into clothing, bedding, and bone, seizing muscles stiff from hours in the saddle and forcing men to huddle around dwindling fires for warmth. Woolen coats, blankets, and hats offered some protection, but the wind that swept across the plains seemed to find every gap, every unguarded inch of skin, chilling the body and sapping strength as surely as any physical exertion. Water from sweat and dust during the day quickly cooled against the night air, leaving damp layers that intensified the cold, while horses, too, shivered in the open, requiring constant attention, feeding, and brushing to keep them from succumbing to fatigue or exposure. Sleep was always a fleeting commodity, measured in short, tense intervals between watches, with dreams punctuated by the sound of distant hooves, the low rumble of a restless herd, or the howling wind that seemed almost sentient as it tore across the prairie. And yet, even in these harshest moments, cowboys found a rhythm, a tacit understanding that survival depended on endurance, adaptability, and a steadfast mind capable of resisting despair. Weather extremes dictated every decision on the trail: when to push the herd, when to rest, when to navigate treacherous terrain, or when to conserve energy for the night ahead. Sun-baked days required careful rationing of water for both men and animals, frequent rests in any patch of shade, and relentless attention to prevent heat stroke or exhaustion. On nights demanded constant vigilance to prevent frostbite, hypothermia, or the loss of animals weakened by cold and fatigue. Through it all, cowboys developed an intimate, almost instinctive connection with the land and sky, reading the shifting clouds, the direction of the wind, and the behavior of the herd to anticipate changes and mitigate danger. They learned to endure, not merely to survive, their bodies and minds forged in a continuous cycle of extremes that demanded courage, resilience, and ingenuity. In the vast openness of the West, where comfort was a luxury and the horizon stretched unbroken in every direction, the weather was a constant, invisible adversary, shaping the lives of those who dared to traverse it, and reminding every man on horseback that the frontier was as much a test of endurance against nature itself as it was a journey toward distant railheads, dusty towns, and a fleeting promise of reward at the end of each grueling drive. Amid the dust, the relentless sun, the biting winds, and the ever-present threat of danger, there existed a quieter, profoundly human dimension to the life of a cowboy, a side rarely captured in the sensationalized tales of Hollywood, but palpably real in the hearts of those who lived it. Each man carried with him only the barest essentials, items that could be packed into a single bedroll, tied with leather straps and swung over a saddle, for mobility was a constant necessity, and possessions were both weight and potential liability on the trail. Within this sparse collection, might be found a spare shirt, a change of socks, a pouch of tobacco, a small knife, or straight razor. And perhaps the one thing that tethered a cowboy to a world beyond the plains, a faded photograph of a mother, a sister, or a young sweetheart, the edges dog-eared and worn from constant handling. The image itself, a fragile window into love, family, and the life left behind. Letters, too, were treasured, carefully folded, and tucked into the lining of a coat or the crevice of a saddlebag. Their words, a lifeline across distance and time, offering comfort, reminders of home, in the hope that there was a world beyond the dust, the sweat, and the endless horizon of the trail. In the moments of brief respite around a campfire or beneath a star-strewn sky, cowboys would sometimes allow themselves the luxury of reflection, taking out these precious mementos to touch, to read, or simply to gaze upon in silence, feeling the weight of memory and longing settle alongside the physical exhaustion of their bodies. Each item was imbued with meaning far greater than its material presence suggested. A photograph could evoke laughter, tears, or a bittersweet ache for simpler times, while a letter might carry a mother's scolding, a sister's news, or a sweetheart's tender words, anchoring the cowboy's identity to a life that existed parallel to, yet distinctly apart from, the grueling demands of the trail. These personal artifacts were not mere tokens. They were reminders of purpose, motivation, and resilience, silently urging the men forward across miles of unforgiving terrain, through scorching days and freezing nights, and through the perils that awaited at every river crossing, stampede, and thunderstorm. Yet these glimpses into home life also underscored the isolation, the profound solitude that accompanied the cowboy's existence, for the vastness of the West, both beautiful and indifferent, left little room for sustained companionship beyond the temporary camaraderie of fellow riders, who themselves were each bound by their own histories, hardships, and attachments. The trail forged bonds that were intense yet ephemeral, friendships built on shared labor and shared danger. But ultimately, every man was tethered to his own memories and emotions, carrying them as quietly and carefully as he carried his possessions. In the stark contrast between the harshness of daily toil and the tenderness found in a worn photograph or a folded letter, the full humanity of the cowboy emerged, not the mythic, invincible figure of legend, but a man navigating longing, loss, love, and hope, all while confronting the physical and psychological trials of life on the open plains, a life defined as much by the stories held close to the heart as by the long hours spent astride a horse guiding a herd through the merciless expanse of the American West. Even as cowboys carried the tender reminders of home, the trail also demanded that they carry a heavier, more somber load, the memories of friends lost to the unforgiving, realities of life on the plains, and the haunting echoes of accidents that could strike without warning, leaving indelible marks on both the body and the spirit. Each mile of dust-swept trail, each river crossed and hill climbed, bore witness to the perils that lurked in the open expanse, and every man knew, often before sunrise, that tragedy was not a distant possibility, but a shadow that traveled beside him, as constant and invisible as the wind itself. Some accidents were sudden and violent, a horse stumbling on uneven ground, sending a rider tumbling into jagged rocks, a runaway steer that crashed through the herd, trampling companions in its panic, a misjudged rope during a desperate attempt to save a calf, binding a man in a split second of chaos. Others were quieter, but no less devastating, the slow decline of a horse injured beyond recovery, the cumulative exhaustion that led a once stalwart cowboy to collapse beneath the unrelenting sun, the subtle creeping effects of illness, infection, and exposure that claimed lives far from the nearest town or doctor. In the flickering firelight of the evenings, when the herd had been bedded down and the stars stretched endlessly across the sky, cowboys often spoke of these moments in hushed tones, sharing stories of those who had fallen, not to sensationalize or frighten, but to remember, to honor, and to instill lessons of vigilance and respect for the trail's merciless nature. Each anecdote carried weight beyond the immediate event, a cautionary tale about the unpredictable behavior of an animal, a reminder of the strength and fragility of human life, for a testament to the courage required to face adversity without complaint. Faces of lost companions lingered in memory, sometimes surfacing unexpectedly in quiet moments. A familiar laugh recalled in the midst of exhaustion, or the echo of a voice that once offered guidance or reassurance during a particularly grueling drive. The trail, with all its monotony, dust, and hours in the saddle, became inseparable from these memories. For every sunset and every mile was marked by the absence of those who had gone before, their stories intertwined with the ongoing journey of the living. Yet these reflections did not diminish the cowboys' resolve. If anything, they strengthened it, for survival depended not only on physical skill, but on a sober, cool understanding of the fragility of life and the necessity of vigilance, empathy, and steady judgment. The memory of friends lost, whether through accident or misfortune, reinforced the importance of every decision, every measured action, and every moment of attentiveness on the trail, creating a culture of respect for both the land and the creatures who shared it. And in this way, even amidst the dust, the heat, and the cold, cowboys forged a quiet, enduring bond with the passed-on awareness that life on the frontier was as much about remembering and honoring those who came before, as it was about navigating the immediate dangers of the present. A continuous interplay of skill, memory, and emotional resilience that defined the human side of the life lived under the vast, unforgiving skies of the American West. Even amidst the dust-choked days, the endless monotony, the relentless sun and freezing nights, the ever-present threat of stampedes, river crossings, and unseen dangers, cowboys carried within themselves a profound and often unspoken question. Why endure such hardships when easier paths existed elsewhere? The answer, whispered in quiet moments alone on the trail, or shared over the crackling warmth of a campfire with trusted companions, was never simple, for it was woven from strands of independence, resilience, and a hunger for freedom that could not be satisfied by the more conventional confines of settled life. Many had grown up on small farms or in tight-knit towns, familiar with toil, but yearning for a life that stretched beyond fences, where horizons were limitless and every day offered a new challenge, a new stretch of land to master, a new story waiting to unfold. Others sought escape from poverty, from oppression, from the constraints of a society that offered them little room to define their own destinies. The trail offered a strange, demanding kind of liberation, a place where skill, courage, and determination mattered more than pedigree, wealth, or social standing. For some, it was the intoxicating blend of danger and camaraderie, the knowledge that each day's survival depended on one's own wit and courage, tempered by the reliance on fellow riders who shared the same hardships, the same long hours in the saddle, and the same fleeting moments of respite by the fire. There was a pride in knowing that a successful cattle drive, a well-guided river crossing, or the calm control of a restless herd was a direct reflection of one's own skill, perseverance, and judgment, an accomplishment earned in a manner far removed from the abstract accolades of town life, or the hollow praise of those who had never felt the stink of dust in their lungs or the ache of muscles that would not relent. Letters and photographs of home reminded them of where they came from, of lives they cherished but could not return to permanently, grounding them even as the frontier demanded relentless attention, adaptability, and courage. And yet, perhaps, above all, it was the raw, elemental beauty of the land itself that drew men back day after day, mile after mile, across plains that stretched unbroken to the horizon, a disguise that transformed from blazing azure to star-strewn darkness in a single sweep of time. There was a freedom in riding alongside a herd of thousands of longhorns, in feeling the wind against one's face, the pulse of a strong horse beneath, the rhythm of hooves beating the dust into clouds, in the silent communion with fellow cowboys who understood instinctively the balance between patience and action, caution and courage, solitude and connection. In this paradoxical life, punishing yet rewarding, monotonous yet alive with sudden drama, isolating yet bound by fleeting but intense bonds, the cowboy found meaning, not in comfort or security, but in the mastery of self, the communion with nature, in the enduring challenge of a life lived fully on one's own terms. A life defined not by ease, but by the raw, unvarnished measure of resilience, endurance, and the unwavering choice to embrace the frontier with every fiber of being. After weeks of relentless movement across open plains, under skies so vast they seemed to stretch into infinity, the approach to a bustling town like Abilene, Kansas, hit with a jarring intensity that no cowboy could fully prepare for. For the endless horizon of dust and grass suddenly gave way to the ordered chaos of civilization, a cacophony of sights, sounds, and smells that clashed sharply with the sparse and elemental life of the trail. The first hint came in the form of smoke curling from chimneys on the distant horizon, signaling hearths, homes, and the strange comfort of buildings that offered both shelter and constraint. A stark contrast to the boundless freedom of the open prairie. As the outfit crested the final rise, the sight of wooden storefronts, the clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestone streets, and the hum of voices spilling from saloons and markets created a sensory overload that could be almost disorienting after the rhythmic monotony of long hours in the saddle, the predictable sounds of the herd, and the natural cadence of wind hoofbeats and animal calls that had to find every day. The streets were crowded with people from every corner of the frontier and beyond, cattle buyers in pressed suits and city hats, traveling salesmen hawking their goods with practiced enthusiasm, townsfolk curious about the arrival of a new herd, and fellow cowboys from other drives, some familiar faces, others rivals whose presence brought the subtle tension of competition and comparison. The abrupt density of life, the closeness of buildings that blocked the horizon, and the cacophony of sound that replaced the natural symphony of prairie winds and cattle calls created a disorienting juxtaposition for men whose senses had been calibrated to the openness of the trail. Horses, too, reacted to the sudden confinement, shifting uneasily beneath their riders, ears flicking toward every unfamiliar noise. Every sudden movement, a reminder that even the animals shared the cowboys' need to adjust, to read the unfamiliar environment, and to navigate the subtle but crucial differences between the open range and the tight confines of town streets. This contrast extended beyond the physical to the emotional and psychological. For where the trail demanded constant vigilance, patience, and an intimate understanding of nature's rhythms, the town presented a new set of challenges: the delicate management of social interactions, the need to negotiate payment for the herd, the negotiation of lodging and supplies, and the careful navigation of spaces filled with both opportunity and potential conflict. Abilene was alive with the promise of reward, yet also fraught with temptation, distraction, and the unpredictability of human behavior. A complexity as challenging in its own way as a river crossing or a sudden thunderstorm. The transition from trail to town, from endless horizons to narrow streets, from dust-choked monotony to the hum of commerce and human interaction, underscored the duality of the cowboy's existence, the ability to thrive in both solitude and society, to navigate the extremes of environment and human complexity, and to carry forward the lessons, skills, and endurance honed over countless days and nights on the unforgiving plains. In this intersection of wilderness and civilization, the cowboy confronted not only the practical demands of town life, but also the emotional realization that the world he had traversed measured in miles and hardships, was now meeting a world of opportunity. Its consequence, in fleeting comfort, a reminder that each drive was a passage, not only across land, but across the spectrum of human experience itself. After the relentless exertion of weeks on the trail, when every hour had been measured in the rhythm of hoofs, the rise and fall of dust clouds, and the ceaseless vigilance required to keep 1,000 Longhorns moving in unison, the arrival in town brought with it a curious mixture of relief, anticipation, and the almost giddy temptation of freedom. For in Abilene and similar frontier towns, the physical and emotional toll of the drive could be momentarily set aside in favor of comfort, distraction, and the small indulgences that human endurance craved after such extended periods of deprivation. The first impulse from many cowboys, once payment had been collected from the trail boss and a herd safely turned over to the railhead buyers, was to venture into the saloon's establishments that offered a heady combination of warmth, companionship, and alcohol that acted as both reward and respite, where the laughter and chatter of men could momentarily drown out the constant presence of dust, fatigue, and danger that had defined the preceding weeks. Whiskey flowed in tin cups and shot glasses, beer foamed in wooden mugs, and the air was thick with smoke, music, and the low murmur of conversations, both casual and intensely personal. A sensory environment that contrasted sharply with the monotony and raw simplicity of life on the open trail. Beyond the saloons, barbershops became sanctuaries of renewal, offering the chance to scrub away the grime, trim hair and beards matted with weeks of dust, and experience the strange comfort of modernity in the form of mirrors, scissors, and running water, all luxuries scarcely imagined on the trail house. For cowboys accustomed to the rough practicality of survival, these moments carried an almost ceremonial quality. Each careful shave, each stroke of soap and towel, a tangible reclamation of dignity and a reminder that civilization, though distant and often unwelcome in its constraints, offered a respite worth savoring. Hotels, too, became havens, with beds raised above the hard ground, sheets clean and soft, and meals served on proper plates with real utensils, a luxury that seemed to both humble and delight the weary men, whose bodies had been accustomed to tin plates, hard bread, and beans cooked over open fire. These moments were not frivolous but essential, the chance to rest, recover, and reconnect with comforts that reinforced the idea that the hardships endured were neither endless nor meaningless, but part of a cycle where effort and endurance earned tangible, immediate rewards. Yet even in indulgence, the cowboy mind remained attuned to the impermanence of town life, for every evening spent in saloons, every hour in the barbershop, every night in a soft bed, was counterbalanced by the knowledge that the trail would soon call again, that the dust and labor would return with all their demands, and that the fleeting pleasures of civilization must be savored with both gratitude and awareness. Money was spent with purpose as well as pleasure. Wages bought not only whiskey and food, but small comforts for the journey ahead, replacements for worn gear, and gifts for loved ones back home. Tangible connections to the world that existed beyond the herd and the horizon. In these interactions, the cowboy's life revealed its full duality, a constant negotiation between survival and reward, toil and indulgence, isolation and social connection, all unfolding against the vivid, sometimes overwhelming backdrop of a frontier town alive with possibility, danger, and the intoxicating allure of freedom, briefly won after a long and punishing journey across the unyielding expanse of the American West. Even amidst the indulgence and relative comfort of town life, the frontier's underlying volatility remained palpable. For Abilene and other booming railhead towns were not merely places of respite and reward, but hubs where rivalries, pride, and the hard-won reputations of cowboys could clash as easily as cattle on the open range, and where the presence of lawmen was both necessary and symbolic. A reminder that civilization, though fragile and often begrudgingly accepted, exerted its authority even over men accustomed to operating under their own rules. Tensions between outfits simmered quietly at first, subtle in the way that glances lingered too long. Laughter carried a little too sharply, or boasting and claims of skill over the trail were exchanged with pointed emphasis. But such undercurrents could escalate swiftly into verbal sparring and, if unchecked, physical confrontation, for the cowboy's pride was as integral to his identity as his endurance. His skill with a lasso, or his ability to endure the relentless hardships of the plains. It was here that town marshals and other lawmen asserted their presence, moving deliberately through saloons and hotel lobbies, their polished badges gleaming in the gaslight, holstered revolvers resting as both deterrent and promise of action should conflicts spiral beyond words. The mere sight of these figures often diffused brewing tempers, commanding a cautious respect even from the most obstinate. For a cowboy well versed in the language of the trail understood the finality of confrontation with a man armed, trained, and resolute. Yet lawmen were not merely enforcers of rules. They were observers of human behavior, attuned to the rhythms of pride, fear, and aggression that pulsed through each outfit and each individual. Stepping in with a mixture of authority and tact, two separate rival factions remind men of the consequences of escalating disputes, and maintain a tenuous balance between order and the chaotic energy that pulsed through frontier towns at night. Fights, when they did erupt, were swift and often brutal. A flash of movement, a clash of fists, or the sudden slide of a booted foot across the saloon floor. Yet rarely did they devolve into lasting carnage, for cowboys knew that survival depended on timing, judgment, quet, and the preservation of both body and reputation. And lawmen ensured that the boundary between spirited conflict and lethal violence remained defined. Between these skirmishes, the towns themselves seemed to pulse with a peculiar rhythm, a combination of revelry and vigilance, where men alternated between celebrating earned wages and guarding against humiliation, injury, or the loss of standing within their peer groups. In this intricate interplay of respect, restraint, and the occasional flare of violence, the full texture of frontier life became apparent. A world in which freedom carried responsibility, camaraderie coexisted with rivalry, and the presence of authority, though sometimes grudgingly acknowledged, was indispensable to the delicate equilibrium that allowed cowboys to enjoy moments of liberty, indulgence, in human connection, without succumbing to the unpredictable chaos that lurked behind every confident smile or casual boast. As the dust settled and the herd found its final place in the railhead pens, the days of relentless exertion on the open trail giving way to the slower, more deliberate rhythms of town life, cowboys found themselves at a rare crossroads, a moment suspended between the toil behind them and the uncertain possibilities ahead, where decisions about the next chapter carried as much weight as the weeks of sweat, sun, and saddle soreness they had just endured. Around the modest tables of saloons, in the quiet corners of hotel rooms, and beside the glowing warmth of evening fires, conversations drifted from tales of the trail into serious deliberations. Should they sign on for another drive with the same outfit, embracing the known rhythm of long hours and relentless responsibility for the promise of wages earned through skill and endurance, or seek employment on ranches where the labor might be steadier, perhaps less perilous, but equally demanding in its own way, offering a more predictable life without the constant unpredictability of river crossings, stampedes, or sudden storms. Others considered moving on entirely, drawn by whispers of opportunity further west, where the frontier stretched with untamed promise, or to fledgling towns where work might differ, yet still required the resilience, toughness, and keen instincts honed over months and years on the trail. Each choice carried its own uncertainties. The comfort of familiarity weighed against the allure of adventure, the security of predictable pay against the possibility of fortune or disaster, in unfamiliar territory. As men pondered these questions, memories of the trail surfaced unbidden, mingling with the smells of cooked meals, the laughter and rivalry of peers, and the quiet ache of muscles still sore from long hours in the saddle, forming a tapestry of experience that both anchored and complicated their decisions. Within these reflections, there was also a subtle acknowledgement of the bonds formed along the trail, relationships shaped by shared danger, exhaustion, and triumph, which influenced choices as much as personal ambition or desire for change. A cowboy might hesitate to leave an outfit with whom he had endured weeks of relentless dust, relentless sun, and relentless responsibility. At the promise of a new start, a different horizon, or the chance to test his mettle in a different context often proved irresistible. Letters from home, reminders of family and life left behind, interwove with these deliberations, prompting consideration not only of personal ambition, but also of connection, responsibility, and the intangible pull of roots and memory that lingered even across the vast distances of the open plains. In the quiet moments before sleep, as the town settled into evening calm, each man contemplated the balance of risk and reward, freedom and obligation, exhaustion and renewal. Some would remain drawn back to the trail as though bound by invisible threads of habit, loyalty, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived according to one's own labor and judgment, while others would seek new directions, carrying the lessons of the drive into unfamiliar landscapes, prepared for the inevitable challenges, yet armed with the unshakable resilience, skill, and perspective that only a life spent on the unforgiving, unpredictable, and beautiful expanse of the American West could instill. And so, with coins in their pockets, dust still clinging to boots and sleeves, and the endless horizon of possibilities stretching before them, each cowboy faced the enduring truth of their existence, that every choice, every step forward was measured not only in distance, but in courage, judgment, and the quiet reckoning of experience earned under skies that had witnessed both their struggles and their triumphs. Even as cowboys considered their next steps, a persistent tension lingered in their hearts, a delicate and unspoken struggle between the quiet pull of home, with its familiar landscapes, family ties, and the comfort of routines long left behind, and the intoxicating, almost primal allure of freedom and adventure that the open trail promised. A life measured not by walls, clocks, or obligations, but by the rhythm of hoofbeats, the wind across endless plains, and the unpredictable dance of cattle and weather under vast, unbroken skies. Letters from loved ones, small photographs carefully tucked into worn leather pouches, and memories of childhood farms or tight-knit frontier communities surfaced unbidden, mingling with the tangible reminders of life on the trail, the familiar weight of saddlebags, the well-worn leather of reins, the persistent grit of dust embedded into every fold of clothing, creating a contrast both comforting and haunting, a sense that one world had been left behind, while another, ever-changing and uncompromising, stretched endlessly ahead. The pull of home was not merely nostalgic. It carried the weight of safety, predictability, and human connection, a stark counterpoint to the relentless challenges of the trail, where sleep was scarce, danger omnipresent, and comfort almost always fleeting. Yet, for many, the trail offered something equally compelling: the freedom to chart one's own course, the exhilaration of skill tested against raw nature, and the unpredictability of both animals and circumstance, and the profound sense of self-reliance forged through weeks, months, and even years spent in isolation under the sun. Stars and storms. The choice between these worlds was never simple, never purely rational, and often evoked a mixture of longing, excitement, fear, and determination, a complex emotional landscape that mirrored the physical terrain they had navigated with so much care and endurance. In quiet moments, beside the campfire or beneath the low light of a saloon, cowboys wrestled with these contrasts, imagining the life they might return to, the family gatherings, the steady work, the familiar smells and sounds of home, while simultaneously feeling the undeniable draw of the open horizon, the thrill of new challenges, the satisfaction of mastering a world that demanded every ounce of attention, strength, and intelligence they could summon. It was a tension that defined the very essence of the cowboy existence. Life constantly balanced between the comfort of roots and the exhilaration of the untamed, between what was known and what lay just beyond the next ridge, where adventure, risk, and the raw, elemental beauty of the frontier awaited those bold enough to answer its call. And in that space between memory and possibility, between hearth and horizon, each man's choices were shaped not merely by circumstance, but by the profound, enduring human desire to reconcile belonging with freedom, responsibility with passion, and the immutable lessons of the past with the infinite promise of the open trail stretching ahead under the vast, unbroken sky. And yet, for all the aches, dust, relentless hours in the saddle, and moments of peril that marked the cowboy's existence, there remained a profound, almost unspoken sense of pride and fulfillment. A recognition that, unlike so many lives constrained by societal expectations, the rhythm of wages, or the faceless bureaucracy of towns and cities, the life of a cowboy was undeniably authentic, raw in its demands and honest in its rewards. There was no pretense on the open trail, no disguises behind polite conversation or carefully constructed appearances. Every day offered the stark clarity of effort matched to outcome, of skill measured against nature, cattle, and circumstance, and of a constant, compromising truth that the world would neither bend nor soften for the weary. In this honesty, men found meaning not in comfort or security, but in knowing precisely where they stood, in the tangible proof of their labor etched into calloused hands, sunburned skin, and the wary but confident eyes that had scanned the horizon through storms, dust clouds, and endless miles of prairie. The authenticity of the lifestyle extended beyond the physical to the emotional and moral dimensions of existence, for on the trail, a man's word, his courage, king, and his loyalty were continually tested, and there were no half measures or illusions of protection. When a stampede thundered across the plain, when a river surged with treacherous force, or when the night brought predators and rustlers, a cowboy discovered, sometimes with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, the limits of his endurance, the depth of his resolve, and the immediacy of human connection required to survive as a collective, even as individuality and self-reliance remained paramount. In these moments, every hardship became a marker of truth, a confirmation that the life he led, though punishing and unglamorous, was grounded in reality in a way few others could claim, offering a stark, unfiltered measure of worth, skill, and character that society in its more civilized forms rarely demanded or appreciated. This honesty and authenticity were further reinforced by the bonds formed among men, born of shared labor and mutual dependence, and by the clarity with which success and failure were defined, leaving no room for self-deception or empty posturing. Even the monotony, the dust, the back-breaking labor, and exhaustion were embraced as components of a whole that was real, unadorned, and inescapably human, providing a sense of purpose, an identity impossible to replicate in towns or cities insulated from the primal forces of nature and necessity. In the end, many cowboys chose to endure the suffering, to return to the trail again and again, not out of habit alone or the allure of wages, but because the lifestyle demanded honesty, rewarded competence, and, in its uncompromising clarity, offered a form of freedom and authenticity that, however harsh, was as rare and invaluable as the vast, unending skies under which they rode. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty pens of Abilene and bathing the town in a soft amber glow, one could not help but reflect on the life that had brought these men from the endless expanse of the open plains to this fleeting pause in civilization, and it became undeniable that the existence of a cowboy, far removed from the romanticized visions of silver screen adventures, was a life defined by its rawness, its unflinching demands, and its elemental connection to the very forces of nature and survival. There were no comforts to soften the edges of experience, no illusions of ease to mask the relentless march of hours beneath the blazing sun or the biting chill of nightfall, and no guarantees of safety or reward beyond what a man could earn through his own hands, instincts, and judgment. Yet within this unvarnished reality lay a profound clarity and purpose that the trappings of a more comfortable, predictable life could scarcely provide. Every sunrise demanded effort. Every trail presented a challenge. Every herd required vigilance, skill, and the delicate balance of patience and assertiveness. Yet it was precisely in these demands that the life revealed its singular, uncompromising truth, that reward was measured not in gold alone, but in mastery, resilience, and the quiet satisfaction of meeting the day's trials with competence and courage. The cowboy's existence was elemental in its simplicity, yet profound in its scope, for it placed man in a direct and unbroken dialogue with the natural world, with animals, with his fellow men, and with the boundaries of his own endurance, forging character and insight that could not be replicated in the confines of a settled town, the predictable routine of a farm, or the regulated cadence of urban employment. To witness a cowboy at work, whether guiding thousands of longhorns across a sweltering prairie, calming a restless herd under a moonlit sky, or navigating the treacherous currents of a swollen river, was to glimpse a life lived at its most elemental, where every action mattered, every decision carried weight, and every moment was defined by authenticity, responsibility, and the relentless push of nature itself. And while the life offered few luxuries and countless hardships, it also provided a kind of freedom, honesty, and clarity that those who had never ridden under endless skies, felt dust in their lungs, or experienced the quiet triumph of completing a drive intact could scarcely understand, reminding us that the essence of cowboy life, in all its darkness and beauty, lay not in glamour or myth, but in the elemental truths of endurance, skill, and the human capacity to thrive amidst challenge and uncertainty. As night fully settled over the town, with the faint sounds of distant trains, the occasional murmur of conversation, and the soft flicker of lanterns marking the edges of saloons and boarding houses, the story of the cowboy remained vivid and instructive, a life neither easy nor romanticized, yet enduring in memory and lesson, offering modern observers a window into a world defined by authenticity, courage, and the elemental struggle between man, nature, and the relentless march of time. A world that continues to fascinate, humble, and inspire those willing to understand it beyond the Hollywood facade, beneath the endless skies, amidst the ceaseless swirl of dust, and over the rolling plains that seem to stretch beyond imagination. The life of a cowboy forged more than just a livelihood. It sculpted character, tested spirit, and instilled qualities that could only be earned through trial, repetition, and shared struggle. Yet, endurance was carved into every muscle, every sinew, every calloused hand, cultivated not through comfort or convenience, but through the relentless demands of long days spent in the saddle, hours that blurred from dawn to dusk as the rhythm of cattle, the whims of weather, and the unforgiving expanse of the frontier dictated the pace of existence. Resilience became as vital as skill, as a man quickly learned that storms could erupt without warning, rivers could rise with sudden fury, and cattle could stampede at the slightest provocation, leaving no margin for hesitation, weakness, or distraction, and offering no second chances to those unprepared for the brutal realities of frontier life. Yet, perhaps most profound was the camaraderie, the intricate, often unspoken bonds that wove men together as they faced a world at once majestic and merciless, relying on one another for guidance, assistance, and sometimes survival itself. on the flickering glow of campfires, in the brief solace of evening meals, and through the shared trials of guiding herds across treacherous terrain, cowboys learned to read each other's strengths, compensate for weaknesses, and trust with the depth that modern lives, insulated by distance and convenience, rarely demand. Laughter and storytelling intermingled with practical instruction, while quiet acts of care checking a comrade's horse for injuries, offering a comforting word during a night watch, or sharing a portion of scarce provisions, became the fabric of daily life, quietly teaching lessons in empathy, loyalty, and the understated heroism of looking out for another in a world where every man faced his own relentless challenges. Through this combination of endurance, resilience, and camaraderie, the cowboy emerged not simply as a laborer or wanderer, but as a figure tempered by adversity, intimately connected to both the land and the men around him, defined by actions rather than words, reputation earned in sweat, skill, and the quiet courage of facing the elements and the unknown each day. These qualities, though born of necessity and hardship, left an enduring legacy, one that transcended the prairie and the trail, shaping a mindset capable of confronting uncertainty with determination, forging bonds that carried emotional weight beyond the immediate danger, and fostering an appreciation for authenticity and integrity in a world that, like the open plains themselves, could be unforgiving yet profoundly illuminating for those willing to meet it head-on. And as the final embers of the campfire flickered against the gathering darkness, leaving only the faint whispers of wind through the prairie grasses and the distant lowing of a resting herd, it became strikingly clear that the life of a cowboy, in all its raw intensity and unflinching demands, was a world apart from the silver screen adventures and dime novel fantasies that would later romanticize the West. Every sunrise brought a test of stamina, skill, and judgment, while every mile of trail offered the stark lessons of risk and consequence, reminding men that survival and success were earned, not imagined, and that the rewards of labor were measured in tangible, immediate terms, whether it was the well-being of the herd, the safety of a fellow rider, or the quiet satisfaction of having met the day's challenges with courage and competence. Unlike the mythic cowboys, who seemed to glide effortlessly through danger, winning shootouts or charming townsfolk with ease, real cowboys navigated endless hours of monotony punctuated by moments of intense peril, endured harsh weather that alternately scalded and froze them, and faced dangers that could claim a horse, a herd, or even a life in an instant, all while remaining vigilant, disciplined, and profoundly connected to the land and the animals they tended. For all its grueling demands, for all the exhaustion that seeped into aching muscles and the dust that settled deep into lungs and eyes, the true cowboy experience offered something far more enduring and meaningful than any Hollywood legend could convey: an unvarnished sense of authenticity, a life measured in skill and character rather than appearances, and a communion with nature, men, and animals that cultivated resilience, patience, and an understanding of human interdependence rarely encountered in more conventional lives. The myths that followed of gunfights, lone heroes, and effortless bravado captured imagination, but obscured the elemental truth that the essence of cowboy life lay in its honesty, its intensity, and its capacity to shape a man through relentless trial, shared labor, and unspoken bonds of trust and camaraderie, leaving a legacy, not a fantasy, but of lived experience, raw and profound, that still resonates today for those willing to look beyond the glamour and glimpse, the life that was truly lived beneath the vast, unending skies of the American frontier. In the end, the real story of the cowboy was not one of effortless adventure or cinematic flair, but of enduring hardship, embracing authenticity, and discovering the profound, sometimes painful lessons that only a life measured by the open trail, the hoofbeats of thousands of cattle, and the quiet bonds of men tested by adversity could provide a story far richer, more complex, and infinitely more instructive than the tales that would later be told in books, films, and folklore, offering a timeless reflection on courage, resilience, and the extraordinary depth of a life lived fully, honestly, and unflinchingly in the face of nature's uncompromising demands. As the vast skies of the American West stretch endlessly overhead, casting long shadows across rolling plains and sun-baked trails, it becomes impossible not to appreciate the stark, unvarnished reality of the cowboy's existence in the 1870s. A life far removed from the glimmering myths that Hollywood and dime novels would later construct. The open trail, stretching mile after mile beneath blazing sun and starlit night, demanded more than mere skill. It required stamina, patience, and a profound acceptance of hardship that few could truly imagine. Cowboys rose before dawn, their bodies stiff and sore from nights spent on the hard, scratchy ground, the thin wool blankets and bedrolls offering little comfort against the chill of morning or the gnawing fatigue of days already long. Meals were simple, practical, and sustaining rather than indulgent beans cooked over the chuck wagon fire. Strips of bacon crisped by embers, biscuits sometimes baked if the cook had time, and coffee strong enough to jolt the senses awake. Every morsel and every cup became a moment of reprieve, brief solace amidst the constant toil of moving thousands of restless longhorns across terrain that was as unpredictable as it was unforgiving. The life of a cowboy was, in its essence, elemental. Dust clung to skin, worked its way into lungs, settled into the eyes, coated clothes so thoroughly that it became part of a man's very identity, a physical reminder of the environment in which survival depended upon vigilance, skill, and sheer endurance. Within this grittiness existed a remarkable tapestry of humanity. Former slaves, Mexican vaqueros, whose expertise taught generations of riders, European immigrants seeking fortune, and young men born on the frontier all came together under the unifying banner of the trail. Despite differences in background, language, or culture, these men shared equal pay, equal danger, and equal exposure to the relentless hardships of life on the range. And in that equality, a subtle yet powerful camaraderie formed a bond, forged not through comfort or luxury, but through necessity, shared effort, and the quiet recognition that each man's life often depended upon the other's. Cattle drives themselves were arduous and perilous undertakings. Cowboys spent hours, often more than 14 AD, in the saddle, guiding herds northward to distant railheads, singing softly to soothe restless cattle during night watches, navigating rivers with treacherous currents, and steering clear of the dangers posed by storms, predators, and sudden noises that could trigger deadly stampedes. Their essential skills, riding, roping, navigation, and animal handling were honed not in classrooms or through instruction manuals, but through unrelenting practice and the constant demands of survival. The trail was a classroom of dust, sweat, and occasional tragedy, where men learned lessons that could not be taught elsewhere. The value of patience, the importance of observation, and the weight of responsibility not only for one's own life, but for the lives of the animals and companions who shared the journey. Yet, alongside the physical trials existed the emotional ones. Cowboys carried little with them beyond the essentials: a spare shirt, pair of socks, a bag of tobacco, and sometimes letters or photographs from loved ones far away. Memories of lost friends, haunting accidents on the trail, and narrow escapes from disaster lingered in the mind, shaping a reflective and often somber inner life. Many wondered why they continued in a role so punishing, and often the answer lay in a combination of freedom, adventure, and a sense of purpose that could not be found in settled towns or untamed farms. Arrival in towns like Abilene, Kansas, offered contrasts that were both stark and jarring. The bustling streets, the allure of saloons, barbershops, and hotels, and the presence of lawmen maintaining fragile order among men eager to spend hard-earned wages and enjoy fleeting leisure after weeks of relentless labor. Yet, even in these towns, the cowboy's mind remained attuned to the trail, aware of the impermanence of comfort and the inevitability of returning to open plains, herds, and the elemental demands of the land. As men contemplated their next steps, signing on for another drive, taking work on a ranch, or venturing elsewhere, they were caught between nostalgia for home and the irresistible call of freedom and adventure. Despite the suffering, the isolation, the relentless weather, and the constant threat of danger, the life offered a purity of honesty and authenticity that few other paths could match. It shaped men through endurance, resilience, and camaraderie, teaching lessons that could not be measured in coin, but only in character, skill, and shared experience. In the end, the true cowboy life was far tougher and far more meaningful than the legends would suggest. A testament to human courage, adaptability, and the profound connection between man, nature, and the community formed on the trail. So as we close this chapter of the open plains, the dust, the herds, and the endless skies, let us remember that beyond the myths lies a world of challenge, camaraderie, and raw, elemental truth, a world that shaped men in ways nothing else could. And now, as the horizon fades into twilight, take a deep breath, settle in, and allow yourself to drift gently into rest, carrying with you the enduring echoes of the cowboy life. Good night, and may your dreams be wide and free as the plains themselves.